Yeah, I went and spent a good 90K on my wrist, and then I got a good 60K in my hand. You feel me? Yeah. This that fight money.
This that fight money.
For real. Yeah, knock him out, Debo. See Debo. Yeah, the little 90K on the road.
This is not just messy. It is heartbreaking. What unfolded on Instagram Live was not gossip, not entertainment, not a calculated publicity move. It was a moment that left the internet stunned, divided, and emotionally charged. Claressa Shields, a woman widely known for her toughness, discipline, and seemingly unbreakable exterior, appeared before thousands of viewers visibly shaken. Her eyes were swollen, her voice trembled. There was no glam team, no polished lighting, no carefully curated background. Just raw emotion. And then she said the words no one expected. She was pregnant. But the pregnancy itself was not what sent shockwaves across social media. It was what she claimed came with it. According to her, the man she trusted, the man who promised her a future, had allegedly lied to her. What she described was not simply a failed relationship. She framed it as a calculated betrayal. She explained that behind closed doors, she had been given assurances. She said she was told that a marriage was already over, that divorce papers were in motion, that it was only a matter of time before everything became official. She claimed she was promised commitment, permanence, and a public future together. These weren't vague hints, she implied. They were repeated conversations, confident statements, timelines that felt concrete. Belief changes behavior. When someone believes they are building a future, they make decisions differently. Shields suggested that her vulnerability did not come from recklessness, but from reliance. She said intimacy was not accidental. It was based on what she believed to be a secure commitment. Then came the delay. According to her, public confirmations never arrived. Announcements were postponed. Reassurances became reactive instead of proactive. Explanations multiplied. Still, she held on. Because belief rarely disappears all at once, it erodes slowly. When she discovered she was pregnant, that erosion turned into fear. She admitted she kept the pregnancy private. Not out of shame, not for publicity strategy, but out of fear. Fear that the moment she revealed the truth, everything would shift. Fear that responsibility would cool the affection she had been shown. Fear that the love she thought was solid might prove conditional. She said she waited because she suspected that once consequences entered the room, promises might leave it. Eventually, she told him, and according to her account, everything changed. She described a sudden shift in tone. What she expected to be joy, or at least partnership, became distance. Where there had once been plans, there were now doubts. Where there had been certainty, there were now questions. She claimed that timelines were challenged. Fidelity was insinuated. Paternity was indirectly questioned. In her telling, she went from future wife to defendant almost overnight. She said the same voice that once spoke confidently about marriage now spoke cautiously about possibilities. Words that had sounded permanent were reframed as misunderstandings. Assurances were reclassified as hypotheticals. The ground did not crack dramatically, it slid quietly beneath her. And while she was processing pregnancy and emotional upheaval, she alleges he returned to New York and reappeared publicly alongside Remy Ma, the very relationship she believed was ending. Photos circulated. Smiles looked effortless. Life appeared. Uninterrupted. The contrast, she suggested, was devastating. One life continued seamlessly. The other paused under the weight of responsibility. At that moment, she said, clarity arrived, not peace clarity. She began to question whether the divorce drama had been genuine or performative, whether public conflict had been strategy rather than closure, whether she'd been part of a narrative designed to manage perception. She did not scream during the live. She did not threaten. She documented. She referenced conversations. She paraphrased promises. She described shifts in behavior. Her tone was not explosive. It was methodical. It felt less like revenge and more like record-keeping. She insisted he was not perfect, but she was honest. She said hiding the pregnancy was not about manipulation. It was about self-preservation in an unstable situation. She refused to carry blame for protecting her child. Silence, she emphasized, does not equal guilt. Trusting the wrong person does not make you complicit in their choices. The internet reacted instantly. Clips spread within minutes. Commentary channels ignited. Supporters flooded her comments with empathy. Critics questioned her timing and motives. The familiar cycle unfolded. Credibility debated, character analyzed, composure scrutinized. Some asked, why speak now? Her answer was simple. Because waiting had become unbearable. Because carrying a life while carrying a lie felt unsustainable. Because silence had started to feel like complicity. She acknowledged backlash before it arrived. She named the labels she expected bitter, emotional, opportunistic, and dismissed them calmly. Labels, she argued, do not erase conversations. They do not undo reliance. They do not negate what was said behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the other side remained largely quiet. There was no detailed rebuttal, no sweeping denial, just distance. And in the court of public opinion, absence speaks loudly. Some interpreted the silence as restraint. Others saw avoidance. The vacuum became a canvas for speculation. As days passed, old interviews resurfaced. Tattoos were discussed. Clips of affectionate exchanges were replayed with new suspicion. Every smile was reinterpreted. Every pause analyzed. The internet does not forget, it reframes. Shields returned online once more, this time steadier. Less visibly shaken, more precise. She shifted the conversation from romance to responsibility. This, she insisted, was not about heartbreak alone. It was about reliance, about what happens when someone builds a future based on representations that later dissolve. She spoke about sleepless nights, medical appointments attended alone, the quiet math of preparing for motherhood without the partnership she believed she would have. None of it dramatic enough for headlines. All of it heavy enough to alter life. The story began to outgrow the individuals involved. It became about narrative control, who gets to speak first, who's last, and who is expected to remain silent. It became about how quickly responsibility can be reframed as inconvenience when it no longer aligns with someone's plans. She said she was done protecting a version of events that did not protect her. Done shrinking to preserve someone else's comfort. Done absorbing doubts so others could avoid accountability. Her final message carried no ultimatums. No threats. Just a boundary. She said she would no longer correct misinformation that relied on her silence to survive. She would speak when necessary and protect her peace when possible. The rest, she said, would unfold without her managing it. The response remained divided. Empathy collided with skepticism. Support clashed with cynicism. But one thing was undeniable. The narrative had shifted. The version that depended on her quiet compliance no longer held unquestioned authority. This is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is a record of what happens when expectations collide with consequences, of how quickly love can turn into litigation when accountability appears, of how power moves when one party refuses to remain silent. If her account is accurate, she was not dealing with confusion but strategy, not miscommunication but misdirection, not just heartbreak but abandonment at a moment when protection mattered most. And if there is one truth that echoed long after the live ended, it is this: silence can be requested, even pressured, but it cannot be enforced forever. When it breaks, it does not whisper. It documents. The room has changed. The record is public. And the questions are not going away.
Look at him, man. Papoose, Papoose, Papoose. 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 Papoose.
Can't be on this. Cause I be on that mug.
Papoose. Yeah. Papoose. 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 Every time I say his name, we get more and more comments. You get the blind. Papoose.
At the end of the day, this is a dangerous game.
At the end of the day, this is a dangerous game. The tension did not dissolve after the initial revelation. It concentrated. What followed was not resolution, but recoil, a tightening of narratives as each side adjusted to the reality that the story no longer moved in a straight line. Analysts, commentators, and anonymous insiders began treating what had been said not as emotion, but as evidence. Timelines were reconstructed. Language was dissected. Silence was interpreted as subtext. The most striking shift was tonal. The conversation moved away from personalities and toward patterns. Viewers stopped asking, "Who is right?" and began, asking, how does this keep happening? How is certainty promised before it is earned? How are futures sketched before responsibilities are accepted? How is the burden of proof quietly reassigned when consequences arrive? She remained visible, but not reactive. There were no daily updates, no public spirals, no attempt to outrun speculation. Instead, she appeared measured and deliberate, as if every word carried a cost she was no longer willing to overpay. When she spoke, she returned to sequence, not sentiment. What was said? When was it said? What followed? What didn't? That steadiness unsettled people. It disrupted the expectation that pain must be chaotic to be credible. Critics searched for contradictions and found none that altered the substance. Supporters searched for catharsis and did not receive it. What they received instead was consistency. Same account delivered without escalation, embellishment, or retreat. Then the ripple effects began. Old footage resurfaced, not because it revealed something entirely new, but because it sounded different now. Statements once dismissed as generic took on sharper edges. Casual remarks about loyalty, timing, and priorities felt less casual in hindsight. The past had not changed, the lens had. She addressed the growing archive with restraint. She refused to narrate every resurfaced clip. She declined to assign motive to every expression frozen in a screenshot. She said the record could speak without her directing it. In a space built on amplification, that refusal became a form of control. The question of accountability returned heavier this time, not as a shouted demand, but as an absence. People began noticing what was not happening. No clarification, no direct engagement with the substance of the claims. No attempt to meet detail with detail. The quiet stretched and interpretations hardened. Some framed the silence as dignity. Others saw avoidance. Even those inclined to defend struggled to explain why reassurance had once been abundant and was now non-existent. Why certainty evaporated precisely when certainty was most needed. Why a situation that required care appeared to receive distance instead. She spoke again, briefly, to center what she said mattered most: stability, not spectacle. Not drama. Stability. She talked about building routines, seeking support, prioritizing health. She avoided naming names. She avoided reopening specifics. She shifted the focus from exposure to endurance. That choice recalibrated the temperature of the conversation. The story stopped being about revelation and started being about responsibility. And endurance is harder to dismiss than outrage. Eventually, the easy arguments ran out. What remained were questions without satisfying answers, the kind that do not trend but linger. What does responsibility look like when plans dissolve? What does honesty require when promises are remembered differently? What does silence cost when one person is left explaining everything? Observers noted how often the burden shifted back to her, to prove restraint, to demonstrate credibility, to remain patient. They noticed how rarely identical standards were publicly applied elsewhere. The imbalance became part of the narrative not as accusation, but as observation. The discourse fractured again, this time along quieter lines. People began sharing their own stories. Not to compete, but to contextualize. Stories of being assured, then abandoned. Of timelines that moved forward only until they required accountability. Of commitments that dissolved under scrutiny. The individual story became collective, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was familiar. She acknowledged that familiarity with a single sentence. This isn't rare. That line resonated because it did not demand outrage. It asked for recognition. As weeks passed, the story stopped accelerating and began settling, not fading, solidifying. The facts, as she presented them, remained consistent. The responses remained limited. The emotional pitch lowered, but the weight increased. In the stillness, the tragedy sharpened. Not because of spectacle, but because of permanence. Trust extended cannot be recalled. Time invested does not reset. Expectations built do not evaporate simply because they become inconvenient. She did not frame herself as a victim. She framed herself as accountable to herself, to what she carries, to the truth as she understands it. That framing denied critics their easiest angle. There was no collapse to exploit, no chaos to mock. There was resolve. Eventually, attention shifted, as it always does. New stories flooded timelines, new controversies demanded reaction. But This one did not disappear, it lingered. Referenced in passing. Invoked as example, cited without full explanation. It became shorthand for a pattern people recognized without needing every detail. She offered no dramatic finale, no demand for apology. No call for judgment. She said what she needed to say and then stopped. That decision marked the true end of spectacle and the beginning of consequence. Because when a story concludes without reconciliation, it does not vanish, it integrates. It becomes part of how audiences listen next time. Part of how promises are evaluated. Part of how silence is interpreted. The tragedy here is not confined to a relationship. It lives in the space between assurance and action. In the gap where responsibility should have stood. In the quiet that followed certainty. In the clarity that arrived too late to prevent damage, but just in time to prevent erasure. Nothing about this resolves neatly. There is no final statement. Tying it together. No coordinated narrative restoring balance. What remains is a record spoken carefully, maintained consistently, and left intact, and records outlast reactions. The room is quieter now, but it has not returned to its original shape. It cannot. Something was said that cannot be unsaid. Something was revealed that cannot be unseen. Even as attention drifts elsewhere, the structure of the story holds. Not because it was shouted, but because it was sustained. That is the part many do not anticipate, the endurance of a narrative that does not chase closure. It does not demand belief. It refuses disappearance. Every screen, every timeline, every comment thread became a witness. The weight of what was said, what was hidden, and what was revealed lingers in digital space. People are watching. People are judging. But more importantly, people are questioning. How far can manipulation reach when promises are weaponized? How easily can trust be reframed as naivety? How often is silence interpreted as weakness when it may be restraint? The silence on the other side continues to speak through its absence. Every unanswered claim, every avoided clarification becomes part of the narrative, whether intended or not. This is not simply entertainment. It is exposure not just of a relationship's collapse, but of the dynamics that allow promises to be made without immediate consequence. It is about power, perception, and the fragile line between assurance and accountability. It is tragic. It is uncomfortable. It is unresolved. And it will not fade quietly. The question is no longer just, what happened? The question is what it means and who carries the weight of that meaning moving forward.